Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa. I am the female half of Been There, Got Out. I am a state certified domestic violence advocate. My male half is Chris. He's a certified high conflict divorce coach. And together we help people dealing with toxic relationships, high conflict divorce and separations, custody battles, and co parenting hell so that they have the chance of the best outcome both in and out of family court. So we love that our content is driven by our clients. And so today we're going to be talking about dealing with a special needs child or children when you have to be trying to parent with a counter parent. So I remember when I was back in college studying education, there was a statistic that I read that said that 9 out of 10 marriages who have special needs children end up in divorce. So my guest today, Lisa Lightner, hopefully can you introduce yourself and tell us why you think this happens?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. My name is Lisa Lightner. I live near Philadelphia with my family. I do have a disabled child. My oldest son is disabled, and he was born with a genetic condition that parents or moms, you can neither cause nor prevent. It's just a random genetic mutation. So he has a lot of needs. When he was a toddler, he was going to an all special needs preschool, and they sent home some information to do some special education advocacy training. And I said to my husband, like, hey, we're going to have to do this IEP thing for the next 20 years. So why don't I do this training? And from there, it just turned out that I ended up volunteering at an agency to help some families with their IEPs, some low income families. From there, I was hired on part-time, and then I don't even remember actually exactly what year, but then I went out on my own. And now most of what I do is actually web-based. My main website, adayinourshoes.com, has, 700 articles about, you name an IEP question and I've probably answered it on the site, although I do still get surprised all the time with new questions. So that's, it started off as, the mom blog scene back in the early 2010s, if you remember that. And then I just really transformed it into a business. And so now I sell products and I sell training. I host webinars. I also have a podcast called Don't IEP Alone. And that is kind of like the business arm of the website, because I don't want anyone to have to IEP alone, as you would say.
Lisa, so can you pause for a second? I'm in education. I know what an IEP is, but I imagine a lot of people listening have no idea. Can you say what an IEP is?
You're right. And thank you, because I do speak in acronyms after having done this for so long. IEP stands for Individualized Education Program. It is a federally defined document. The federal government in 1975 passed a monumental piece of legislation called IDEA, or IDEA, and that is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And that is the statute that governs IEPs. But basically what an IEP is, it's the program of what a child is going to receive because they are not able to access their education as the same way as a non-disabled child.
And that would include like certain accommodations that would be different than someone who's not labeled.
Right. It includes accommodations. It includes specific strategies and interventions. It also includes what they refer to as your IEP related services. And related services are OT, PT, speech.
What's OT and PT, Lisa?
Occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy, vision services if your child is visually impaired, nursing if your child needs a nurse, and counseling. Counseling is a related service on an IEP. So if a child needs counseling at school, there are about 10 or 15 of them.
Okay. And what would prompt somebody, like, how would I know if my child would even require an IEP?
Most parents come to me with nothing more than a gut feeling, right? It's just that they know things at school aren't going well, but they're kind of really struggling to define it or figure out exactly what's going on. but you know that your child is not doing well in school. And it's not even necessarily just not doing well as far as grades. It can be issues of school refusal. It can be issues of bullying. It can be issues of like anxiety attacks at school, things like that, behaviors, negative behaviors occurring at school that are maybe out of characteristic for your child. So the first step would be to go and speak with the teacher, and then in writing, you want to request evaluations, and you want to say, you know what, I think there's something going on here, and I want my child evaluated for special education services.
Okay, now what about costs?
No, so that is one of the main tenets of this IDEA. And the Supreme Court actually defined this in the early 80s, that it's another acronym is FAPE, FAPE, which stands for Free and Appropriate Education. So every child in America is federally entitled to a free and appropriate education. So parents are not to pay for it.
Okay, and this is if it's in a public school, right? It might be different in a private school. And the
Correct.
reason I know this is because I was a public high school teacher.
Correct. Private schools are not bound to IDEA. They are not required to provide special education, and therefore most of them do not.
Okay, yeah, that's really good to know. All right, so now let's get to our community. We are talking to people, many of whom have gotten out of and still enmeshed in a relationship with a very difficult ex. And one of the most common things that we see with our people is that once a child has been diagnosed with some kind of special needs or disability, the other parent says, I disagree with this diagnosis. How does one deal with that?
So probably not going to necessarily like my answer, but this is something that I see frequently in what I do. I've been doing this now, excuse me, since 2011. And it is something as far as couples not agreeing. And sometimes the couples are even still together and
Right.
they don't agree, because there is still, and I got to be honest, there is still a lot of, I'm trying to think of the word, like internal bias, particularly I find in fathers, that fathers are much slower to come to acceptance with any type of disability often. Now, this is just a trend I see, and I don't want dads to reach out and say, I'm not like that. No, of course, not every dad is like that. I'm just telling you, as a trend, I see a lot of moms will come to me and they'll say, well, he's struggling in school and he's not paying attention and he's getting into trouble and he's acting out and all these things. And the dads will say, well, he just needs to smarten up, or he just needs to pay attention, or, things like that. So I do find that dads are kind of slower to come around. That being said, I did speak with a family just last night, as a matter of fact. And the wife, the mom, is not, I don't want this to turn into a race or a cultural thing, but in her culture, she's not American by birth. And in her culture, to have a disabled child, in particular, to have one with autism, is still very much seen as a shameful thing. And it's still seen as something that the parents caused to happen and things like that. So she was really struggling with their recent diagnosis of their child. So if you are in those positions, and to add to it that the parents don't get along, as an understatement, I think, with your audience to say that they don't get along, what you really have to do is you have to get it spelled out in your legal custody agreement. Who has educational rights? Who has educational decision-making power? Who makes these decisions? Because schools cannot, and really they should not, get involved in these kinds of disputes. It's not up to them to decide who gets to come to the IEP meeting. It's up to the divorce decree or the custody arrangement to just say who's going to do this. Because a common problem that I run into, and I don't have a ton of domestic violence kind of situations, but what I run into a lot is parents are split up, and it's not necessarily volatile, but it wasn't a happy ending.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't want the new boyfriend or girlfriend coming to the IEP meeting. And so they
Mm.
say like, oh, well, he's inviting her, especially if it's an infidelity issue, right? Like you don't want to see them at this, because IEP meetings for parents who aren't familiar with this process, or if you're new to this process, they're a very emotional experience, right? It's very, you feel very like you don't have any skin on, like it's a very like, because that's just it. You're talking about like all the ways that your child isn't measuring up to their peers. And that's hard information to take in, right? If you're trying to close that gap between your child and their peers. So a lot of that, like, well, I don't want the new girlfriend there. How do I uninvite her to the meeting? How do I, and you can't. If the dad is permitted to be at the IEP meeting because you have joint custody, he's permitted to invite whoever he wants. He can invite the whole neighborhood if he wants. And so, like I said, an IEP team isn't going to step in and say, oh, no, well, she can't come. I will say that if a parent and the IEP team are at disagreement over something, and maybe it's like maybe they want to send them to an out of district placement or self-contained classroom that the parent doesn't want. If the IEP team senses this tension between parents, and one of the parents agrees with them and one of them doesn't, like they're going to use that. They're going to
Right.
use that. And they're going to, well, dad wants this. I don't see why you're not agreeing to it. Dad's on board with it. And that kind of thing. So it's
Yeah.
not, my heart goes out to, the IEP process on its own is very stressful and cumbersome. So my heart goes out to these families who have these additional burdens of having to navigate violent relationships or formerly violent relationships, where there are a lot of hard feelings and there's a lot of mistrust, and, rightfully so.
Yeah. So you mentioned like having that legal custody agreement. We often refer to it as a parenting plan. So if one person has legal, let's say, predominant or sole legal decision making on education, that person might actually have the ability to not allow the other parent to be present at an IEP meeting.
If that's what the if that's what the if that's what they came to at the end of a divorce, and I say divorce, but I know that not all couples are married and
Right.
split up after not having been married. So whatever that divorce decree or custody arrangement or parenting plan says, that legally binding agreement, that's what the school is required to uphold.
Right. So this is making me think that anyone who is dealing with a difficult divorce or separation or custody battle, they need to seriously consider having very specific language regarding their special needs child's education. Because, like Lisa just said, if it's not clear, you can run into a lot of problems. So, Lisa, thank you so much for mentioning that. That's going to be really, really helpful moving forward.
It is. And it creates more issues with parents and schools, because parents are looking to the school to help them, and it's like, that's not an IEP issue. Like, I get it that we're talking about the IEP, but what we're really talking about is educational decision making,
Right.
and
And
just like medical,
responsibility.
yeah, just like medical responsibilities and all that. That's what we're really talking about here, and that's not an IEP issue.
Right. So let's say I'm in that kind of situation and I'm at a team meeting and my ex is there and we don't agree. How much authority does the school have if it's joint legal? If the school is recommending these are the accommodations that should be made for this child, and that one parent doesn't agree, what do they do when it's joint legal?
Most of the time, and I'm not a lawyer and I don't play one on the internet, but most of the time, schools are only required to have one signature.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
So again, if that's something that, all these decisions have to be jointly agreed to, that's something that the school needs to be made aware of. Because the other thing, the other flip side of it is that I've also run into situations where parents had joint custody, joint decision making power, and the relationship wasn't great, but it wasn't volatile. And the IEP team, when they send out the invitation, they only have to send it out to the address on file.
Really? So
Unless,
the primary
right, the
residential
primary
parent.
residence, whatever's on file. So if you're not keen on speaking to your ex all that often, and you get this invitation, email, mail, whatever, you might just you just don't feel like talking to him. So you're like, whatever, I'm sure the school will send him an invitation. But what if they don't? Right? Or what if you're the mom and he lives with dad and they don't send mom the invitation, and then mom's like, this happens in real life, that a couple weeks later, mom finds out that there was an IEP meeting and she wasn't invited. But the school fulfilled their obligation. They invited the parent at the primary residence, and unless directed otherwise, that's all they have to do.
That is really helpful, because I know in our world, when that happens, nobody can blame the school, but they can blame their ex, especially if they have joint legal decision making and they're both supposed to have the same access to records. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I know that alone is a lot of people are going to take that note down and pay
Yeah.
close attention. So
Yeah,
thanks again for that.
let the school know. If both parents are to be invited, you need to let the school know.
Okay, great. All right, let me throw something at you that just came up the other day with one of our clients. So when there's a special needs child, that we have a situation where a child is very, very young and there's been a relocation. So one of the parents lives a lot farther away. And the way the access schedule is, the child only sees the faraway parent infrequently. Let's say like 1 week a month, and the child has to fly on a plane with one of the parents. And so we've been told that the child with the autism, it's really, really hard for this kid to be on a plane. It's torture for everyone. Is there anything that you would recommend somebody do to try to, again, mitigate a circumstance like that?
Gosh, and I hate when kids get caught in the middle like this.
I know.
It's so unfortunate. Um, no, and I live this firsthand. My son doesn't travel well. I get it. He doesn't travel well, and some people just don't, and that's okay. Other than doing what's out there for kids who are autistic, things like social stories and rehearsing and reading books and trying to, prepare him start to finish for these monthly flights. That would be the only option that I'd see to kind of get him over that hump. See what, I would talk with teachers and clinicians around him to, what do you recommend to help him with this?
What was the first thing you said?
Social stories.
Social stories. What are social stories?
A social story is, they're usually just images. Sometimes they're a flip book. Sometimes they're like Velcro on a long piece of cardboard. But you can find them online from blogs like mine. I don't have any, but a lot of bloggers do. Or Teachers Pay Teachers, those kinds of websites where they sell educational kind of things. But it's basically like a picture story explaining a situation to a child. They've become common. Some kids do really well with them. My son couldn't care less about them. It doesn't, it doesn't help him at all.
Yeah.
But a lot of parents have found success with them. And it's just a way to like verbally and with a picture kind of walk through, like, okay, tomorrow, this is what we're going to do. Remember, we're going to drive to the airport and there's going to be an airplane and all these different things to kind of just prepare them for the adventure.
So that kind of goes together with the next thing you said about role playing. So it's helpful to get children ready beforehand and to practice what it's going to be like, so they know what to expect.
Right. Yes. And like I said, reading books, look on YouTube to see if there's like fun videos. If the child in particular like has a connection to a certain character or cartoon or anything like that, like if you like SpongeBob, like Google on YouTube, like, is there an episode where SpongeBob gets on a plane? Like, I don't know. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But things like that, like like see what all you can do to kind of connect and bring down the level of tension.
That's really, really helpful. Okay, here's another one. Child support with special needs kids.
Mm-hmm.
There's been issues where sometimes the person still requires needs and aid past the age of 18. I know in a number of states, child support goes not only till the age of 18, but until the child graduates high school. But it's not always the same. Do you have any experience with what to do or what rights people or special needs kids have, um, age wise or state wise, regarding that?
So IDEA, again, that federal statute that's 50 years old, IDEA says that kids with IEPs can stay in school. It says up to 21 inclusive. Some states have interpreted that a little bit differently. But you're looking at somewhere in most states, 20 to 22 years old, the child can stay in school. I also believe that, as far as I know, it hasn't been overturned yet. Not for lack of trying. Of course, the Congress has repeatedly tried to overturn ACA or Obamacare, and that has a provision in it that an adult child can stay on their parents' insurance until 26.
Mm-hmm.
So you should, as far as that, you'd quote unquote be considered a child or still a student anyway until they leave the school system, which I believe most states have followed suit, as far as that goes. Now, when a child does exit the public school system, it varies tremendously state by state as far as what is available, as far as funding, programs, living options, career job options, stuff like that. That varies tremendously from state to state. And in some states, there's virtually nothing. And the parent is just expected to pick up all the slack.
Mm.
And some states have very thorough and robust programs for disabled adults.
Do you know which states have the really good programs versus the really bad ones off the top of your head?
Generally, you're going to find it in the more densely populated, but also known as the more expensive to live in states: New York, New Jersey, California, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and places like that.
Oh, that's good to know because that's where we also have a number of our clients.
Right. So that's where, that's where you tend to find this stuff. Now, that being said, yes, Pennsylvania, and that's where I live. Pennsylvania has some very decent programs. We also have a 10-year wait list for them.
Oh, boy.
So even if there's decent programming, you might run into other options. But disabled adults can apply for, it's not a guarantee that you're going to be receive it, but you can apply for Social Security as a disabled adult. So that might be one option for parents.
Okay. Here's another thing that's come up a few times: guardianship. So what ideas do you have with that when you've got two parents completely on opposite pages?
And that's changed a lot in recent years. The pendulum has really swung. It used to be, guardianship, and that if you had a disabled adult child, you got guardianship, and that was it as the parent, right? The parent or an older sibling, something like that. However, guardianship does take away a person's autonomy, and that's a big deal, right? That's a really big deal, to take away someone's autonomy and decision-making power over themselves, right? This is not something to be entered into lightly. And so we did have a lot of disabled adults who were self-advocating and saying, I can do a lot of stuff for myself. I don't need someone to make all my decisions for me. So the pendulum is kind of swinging back the other way to where disabled adults do have more rights or more recognized rights than they did, even just a decade ago. Guardianship is a lengthy process. It requires an attorney. It is several $1,000s. You do have to go to court, and you do have to demonstrate that this person cannot make decisions for themselves, that they do need someone to um, to have guardianship. But the thing is that now there's different levels, and there's supported decision making, and that's a term that's getting a lot more buzz, and it's called supported decision making, where maybe you just get a joint bank account to where two adults have to sign off on any purchase over $500, or things like that, so that the person doesn't necessarily have to give up all their autonomy, all their independence, so to speak. But I've had it explained to me by an attorney who does this for a living, and he said, adults are allowed to wander the planet, of free will, right? We're allowed to go out and walk around and go wherever we want as human beings. So if you do have an adult who tends to wander, or what they call it in the autism world is elope, there's not an obligation to go look for them. If nobody has guardianship over your adult child, they wander away from the home, well, they're allowed to do that. They're an adult. Adults can go wander around their community. So there can be some safety issues to consider.
Mm-hmm.
I had a friend, and I had been telling her this for a long time, to do these, put some of these measures in place. And her adult son, he was in his early 20s at the time, he ended up in a mental hospital with an involuntary hold, right? A 72-hour hold, which I'm sure in your world you've heard of those.
Mm-hmm.
And so this happened, and she went there, and she said, well, they won't tell me anything. Well, no, they won't tell you anything.
Right.
Because he's a legal adult. And according to HIPAA, they're not allowed to disclose his medical information. Doesn't matter if you're his mother. If you don't have that legal piece of paper that says you're entitled to receive that information, they don't have to give it to you.
Interesting.
So it's a lot for the brain to comprehend, but you really have to think of, if you have your disabled child as you're going through life, think about all these different scenarios and what could happen. And what am I going to need access to? Am I going to need access to financial information, medical information, things like that? What kind of supported living are they going to need?
So again,
it really is only a small number of people who need the full guardianship. And that's fine, but we should still have access to them. And in some states, the pendulum has swung too far, and it's almost impossible to get guardianship in some states.
mm-hmm.
So
again, my mind is going to planning in terms of if you're getting a divorce or a separation, or in the midst of some kind of custody dispute, to really have things spelled out, because it's not just during that moment when you're separating that you have to think about. You have to think about the extent of the child's life when you still would have control over
right.
what they do. So that's really significant. I think a lot of people don't think ahead that much.
Right. And there's a lot, and this is on my radar because we're actually going through it right now. Now, my son doesn't have the ability to make choices, right? And he doesn't have the ability to manage his seizure medications, and he cannot talk. So it's a lot, right? He can't talk, and he cannot read and write, and he's tube fed, and he can't feed himself. So this is a situation where it's warranted. So we're going through it right now. But you have to go, like I said, you have to go through a lawyer, and you have to go to court over it. And also what we've learned is that we are not permitted as parents. We cannot will this or leave this to our other son. So when we pass away, he's going to have to start over, and he's going to have to go to court again with his brother and demonstrate that he should be given full guardianship. You can't pass it on to someone like, okay, I'll do it, and then you can do it. Like,
oh, this is really important, because I have a very close friend who's in this situation, the exact situation where the middle child, and it's 3 boys, the middle child is in his mid-20s, the oldest child is almost 40, and the youngest is in his early 20s. And my friend and her husband are just terrified, like, what's going to happen to our son in the middle? And the brothers have said, oh, we'll take care of it. but I don't think she realizes that it will be a legal process and starting all over again. So I'm so glad you mentioned this.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot. But if you think about, I mean, if you think about it from a human rights perspective, like, no, I shouldn't be able to, like, if I have guardianship of my child and I've taken away all of his rights, I shouldn't be able to take my son's rights and give them to someone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. I mean, you shouldn't. It's, it makes sense from that standpoint.
Right. Right.
But
Oh,
again, go ahead.
okay. No, and now I'm thinking of something that's even more of an emotional issue in our community, and I'm sure in regular, less conflict situations where there are multiple children in a family. In our cases, the family is split, and one of the parents kind of favors the children without special needs. How do you deal with that when a special needs child is aware enough to realize that the parent really has kind of discarded them, almost like they discarded the other parent, or just isn't really interested, and there's a lot of favoritism? How can you communicate that? I know this is like a rhetorical question.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, other than, and I know that not everybody has the means to do so, but finding a good child psychologist that deals with this kind of stuff, because I can't say the word on podcast what I really want to say, right?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
I won't say it because you'll have to bleep it out. That's a really crappy thing to do to a kid. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it would be in the child's best interest for the other parent to get sole custody, because it's really damaging. It's
Mm-hmm.
really damaging to have to live in that situation. So I don't know. I don't know if that's an option, but I would say starting with a good child psychologist, at your pediatrician's office, and ask.
Yeah. Yeah. Are there psychologists who deal specifically, like we know we talk about lawyers that deal with disabilities or disability advocates, but I've never heard of therapists who are very specific. Is there something that people should look for? Are there labels, like family systems therapists? But do you know like any specialists that should be on parents' radar for something like this?
No, I mean, I know that in recent years, trauma in kids and ACEs, adverse childhood
Hmm.
experiences, like, we know that that's getting a lot more buzz, but I don't know that it's amounted to much more than buzz at this point.
Right.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
we do trauma informed education, but I'm not seeing anything different. So I don't know if that would be like one way to kind of look for it.
Hmm.
Um, because I, like I said, I think it's getting a lot more buzz, but I haven't seen that in practice as much.
Well, this is making me think of a part of a chapter in our book when we talk about how to find the right attorney for your case. It's almost like how to find the right therapist for your child. And one of the questions to ask a prospective therapist might be, how would you communicate best or establish a rapport with a child like mine? Because you want to make sure that they've had experience with kids like yours. And you also want to make sure that they've actually listened to the issues that are of concern and have some kind of strategy for communicating well with this child.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it goes to the greater concept that we have in this country. You hear it on the news all the time. Oh, we have a mental health crisis. We have a mental health crisis. One of the things that I do in all my training and everything else is, like, I tell you what should be, but I'm also going to tell you what is, because those two don't match up. And when you talk about these, like, okay, we have a mental health crisis, the fact is a lot of people can't find mental health help because there
Mhm.
aren't enough providers. There aren't enough qualified providers. So yeah, it's great to sit here and say, oh, well, you should really find a good counselor. That's not going to be an easy task. And I think, that we need to be honest about that. I
Yeah.
think, because they're just not out there, and we do need to fix that in this country.
Yeah. Now, are there I always think that it's great to get word of mouth recommendations from people in similar situations. And now with social media and online resources, we are able to talk to more people. Are there certain communities that you would recommend where people can go to get some general support or resources?
I don't, just because I'm in touch with so many different people and disabilities and parts of the country, and I've worked with a lot of families who live in really remote areas where it doesn't matter what you mention, it's not going to be available to them
Mhm.
because they live 75 miles from the nearest town. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Um, I would say listen, but do your own research and don't rely on their interpretation, their opinion, whatever, because unless it's a really good friend that you see in person and you see their kid and all that, and you know them, or maybe it's a coworker or something like that, you don't know what their kid has. You don't know what, and I think we've gotten too comfortable in not realizing that what people put on social media is such a narrow view
Mhm.
of, a couple of sentences of, oh, I liked this doctor and it went really well and he's great. And we don't see the whole realm of what that person's living each day. And it might be completely different from what you need and what you have in your house.
What you're describing is a perfect parallel to our clients when they're trying to find someone to help with their divorce, or what did you do? What are the strategies? And again, it's a completely different situation. Everyone's is different. What works for one person might actually harm you. And so it is important to always do your own research, and especially with finding someone to work with your child to make sure that they're safe, that your child has a good rapport,
Yes.
etc.
Yeah.
So Lisa, thank you so much for all of this wisdom and information. How can people find you?
Sure. So my main site is adayinourshoes.com. Where you can just search your little heart out to find, articles, videos, PDFs, lists upon lists of anything that you might need for IEP development, preparing for IEP meetings. And then adayinourshoes.org is a much smaller page, but it offers the products that I sell. I have an IEP toolkit. I offer online training and a whole bunch of, you can find the information for the podcast there and a whole lot of other things.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much again. And I hope this has been helpful for a lot of people. I know it will be.
Thank you.
And we'll catch up soon.
Yes.
Okay, bye.